Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Ethereum, and we're going to be specifically providing an outlook for the Ether Bitcoin valuation. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and remember to check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. So, as you guys know, the last several videos that I've done on Ethereum have been relatively bearish. And unfortunately, it's just the season that we're currently in. To remind you of what we've sort of talked about, to see if we're on track with it, if we're not, has it changed our outlook? If we go back and look at the last few videos, we talked about Ethereum's valuation against Bitcoin looking like it's in some type of Wyckoff distribution when it was at 0.073, with the idea that it's ultimately going to break back down to this trend line. Okay, if we go back and look at where Ether Bitcoin is right now, you can in fact see that we're now resting on that trend line that we discussed in that video. Okay, so that at least initial breakdown has occurred. It doesn't mean that it will continue. I should be clear. It doesn't mean that it will continue. I think it'll likely continue, to be honest, but it doesn't mean that it will. But this at least initial breakdown from this idea of it being Wyckoff distributions does in fact seem to be playing out. We talked about, will the tension be released? Right? Like, will the tension on the ETHUSD valuation be released? And you can see that, in fact, it was released, like it always tends to be during these phases. If you go back and look at 2016, you could argue that it was released and we put in a lower low. And then if you go back over here, you could argue that that the tension was eventually released. And again, you can see here, once again, we are ultimately releasing the tension that was in Ethereum. Okay, we were unable to hold that higher low. But in the same way that we're unable to hold the higher low on the USD valuation, I suspect we will be unable to hold the higher low on the Ether Bitcoin valuation. Okay, so this is a key thing to remember, is that it's not always about how it performs against the US dollar, it's how it performs against Bitcoin. Okay, so we also, again, we did an updated video over here where we also talked about it being Wyckoff distribution just a few weeks ago. Now, I wanted to continue to provide an update on this and talk about why I am somewhat bearish on the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation, especially over the rest of this year. And it's actually it's not too convoluted of reasoning, right? I mean, partially we just recognize that except for last year, except for 2021, Ether's valuation against Bitcoin tends to bleed in the second half of the year, okay? You can see it did it in 2015, it did it in 2016, in 2017, in 2018, in 2019, in 2020. It just tends to bleed during the second half of the year. But furthermore, it tends to break out in December or Q1, right? December or Q1. You can see it happened here, and again, I mean, every single time it's like it either happens in December or Q1 of the following year. And yet again, we find ourselves in the precarious position of, are we right now at a point where we are just above the breakdown area, just above it? And I'd say this is what's likely going to happen, is that we might hold this line for a little bit longer, maybe a couple more weeks. I don't really know. But I do think it will ultimately break down, and we'll go back down to some lower valuations of Ethereum against Bitcoin. And we've been saying this for months. I do think it is playing out. And one of the reasons, I think some of the most compelling evidence for this thesis, which you're fine to disagree with. Again, I don't stand to gain anything, right? I'm just informing you of what my opinion is. If you go look at what Bitcoin did again back in 2018, and remember, it was upon the first lower low, right? Look at this. Look closely at this trend that Bitcoin had in 2018. A low, a higher low. We broke it and ultimately put in a lower low. Again, you can also relate this back to the 200-day moving average and the rejection off the 200-day moving average after putting in and then putting in a lower low, right? A low, a higher low, rejection, a lower low. This occurred in June. The lower low finalized itself in June. It then rallied back up until the end of July, early August. Okay, now I'm sort of hoping that we'll see something similar for Bitcoin yet again, right? I hope we see this rally. It's unclear if we will, but I do hope we in fact see it. You can see it's a fairly similar trend. But what's interesting is that look what happened upon the lower low. June 29th of 2018. June 29th. What do you think happened June 29th of 2018? June 29th of 2018, Ether was sitting on a cliff, right? It was right here, right there. So technically, you could argue that it wasn't yet putting in a lower low. It was putting in higher lows, right? I mean, you could say, I mean, I don't know what type of trend line this is, but maybe you could say it was putting in higher lows. However, it was unable to hold it. And the reason I think it was unable to hold it was because, as we said, the confidence in the market was lost because Bitcoin put in a lower low. So even though Bitcoin rallied, right, even though Bitcoin rallied back up to the 200-day moving average by late July, the Ether Bitcoin valuation to continue to go down, right? It continued to go down. That's the sign that people are capitulating back to Bitcoin, okay? It's the sign that people are giving up on the rest of the market and they're just going to hunker down in Bitcoin for a while until things look better. I would argue Ethereum's a blue chip. And the reason I say that, most altcoins are not only bleeding against Bitcoin right now, they're also bleeding against Ether. So if you disagree with me about the Ether Bitcoin valuation breaking down, then perhaps Ether would be the refuge that you seek from the altcoin market. But if you do agree with me that the Ether Bitcoin valuation is breaking down, then Bitcoin would in fact be the better refuge over Ethereum during a Bitcoin bear market. Ethereum does not tend to outperform Bitcoin during Bitcoin bear markets. Okay. Now you might say, well, if Bitcoin's in a bear market, why not just go to US dollars? Well, you could do that, right? I mean, you could go to US dollars. However, going to Bitcoin does give you some luxury as to still having exposure to the asset class in case Bitcoin goes higher. So imagine Bitcoin does get that pump back up to the 200-day moving average, like it did in 2018. That would be a nice wave to ride. And even if it does that, the Ether Bitcoin valuation could still bleed just like it did in 2018. You'll note that it started to slowly bleed in late May and early June, but the real breakdown didn't come until July, August, and September. Now, we are 1 month ahead of schedule compared to 2018 because the peak for Bitcoin occurred in November as opposed to December. And you can see that the rejection off the 200-day also came about a month early. Here it came in April, but over here it came in May. The first lower low over here occurred in June. You could argue that this one occurred in May, okay? Assuming this is the lower low and it's not going to go lower, which again it could. So the real breakdown by Ether Bitcoin, while it started a slow downtrend upon the lower low, it really occurred when Bitcoin bounced, and then when Bitcoin got rejected, it just continued on down, right? So Bitcoin got rejected, came back down to the bottom of the range, and then it just continued back down. So imagine Bitcoin were to go back up to the 200-day moving average, at some point, and then get rejected. It could come right back down here, but the Ether Bitcoin valuation could in fact give up this support during that phase, and Ether could be at a lower price if that were to occur. If Bitcoin were to go back up to say 35K or 40K and then come back down, I would expect Ether's valuation against the US dollar, in fact, to be at a lower price than it is today, just because it is, a lot of people are losing confidence in the crypto markets here in the short term. So if you look, remember this occurred in July. The main breakdown of the Ether Bitcoin valuation it started in July and then really went into August and September. For this cycle, that would correspond to June, right? So sometime in June, July, and August potentially. Now you might say, well, does that make sense? Does it make sense for Ether to not do that well in June, July, and August? Well, why don't we go consult the 90-day ROI of Ether? Why don't we go look at that? You'll notice that June, July, and August are basically the worst months for Ethereum in terms of your 90-day ROI. So on average, 90-day ROI of Ether, buying it in June, July, and August is the worst. So then the argument goes, if Bitcoin's in a bear market and Bitcoin is put in a lower low, and if it's getting rejected off resistance levels, and we understand that the summer is not good for Ethereum, and even if Bitcoin does bounce, history shows us that the Bitcoin dominance is going to go up either way. Today is a day where the Bitcoin price is up. Guess what? Dominance is up too. This, again, looks like Wyckoff distribution. You might say, what has been smoking? This doesn't look like distribution. Distribution looks like something like what we saw in 2021 for Bitcoin, right? Where you have these four peaks, okay? So the argument is, well, how can this be Wyckoff distribution? Looks nothing like it. Well, you go to look at 100 minus the Bitcoin dominance, right? Which is just the altcoin dominance. Looks like the same thing, right? It looks like Wyckoff distribution. You're looking at the exact same chart, right? I mean, it's the same thing for Bitcoin. Bitcoin USD broke down after Wyckoff distribution. It went into an accumulation phase, and then it came back up. Maybe the same thing will occur with Ethereum. You know, it's possible. Perhaps it breaks down, right? Maybe it breaks down going into the end of the year. And then by Q1 of 2023, maybe it gets another bounce back up and it comes back up this way for all we know. Okay? But you should look at this and recognize there are a lot of similarities between what was going on with Ethereum back in 2018 and its valuation against Bitcoin. You could relate the valuation of Ethereum's Bitcoin valuation similarities to the Wyckoff distribution similarities of Bitcoin USD back in early 2021. If you remember, the Bitcoin dominance broke up in June, July, and August. Even though Bitcoin bounced, a lot of people are used to when Bitcoin bounces, it means altcoins outperform it, not when we're below the bull market support band, not when we're getting rejected by the 200-day. Again, everyone has a plan with alts until we get rejected by the 200-day, and then their plan is gone. So remember, Bitcoin is put in a lower low, and normally, under most circumstances, during a bounce in a bull market, you would expect Ether to do well. But, and I'm not saying it won't do well. If Bitcoin bounces, rest assured, Ether USD is likely going to go up with it. I'm specifically talking about the Ether Bitcoin valuation. So please understand what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about Ether USD. I'm talking about Ether Bitcoin. The argument is that if Bitcoin does magically get above the 200-day moving average and go on another bull run, Bitcoin is still where you want to be. Look at the Bitcoin dominance in 2018. It went up. But it also went up during the 2019 bull market for Bitcoin. And it also went up during the parabolic rally of late 2020 and early 2021. So the argument is whether Bitcoin is in a bear market or whether it goes into a bull market, it doesn't matter. Bitcoin should outperform for a while. Okay? So that's the argument with the Bitcoin dominance. Again, you go back and look at the Ether Bitcoin valuation. It looks pretty clear to me. Anytime something looks too clear, I have to wonder, what is it that I'm missing? What is it, right? People talk about the merge. Okay, so could the merge affect things? I will say this, and I've said this before in the other videos. The reason why I'm not so short-term optimistic on the merge is because, first of all, we've been waiting for it forever, so it could easily get pushed off, okay? And if it continues to get delayed, it'll likely lead to the further devaluation of the Ether Bitcoin valuation. So that's number one. It's supposed to happen in August, but if it just gets pushed off to September or October, you could imagine that it would just bleed as investors sort of lose hope in the short term. I think it will eventually come, and people will be excited about it. But if it gets pushed off, that could lead to a waning Ether Bitcoin valuation. Furthermore, the transition of something during a bear market is only going to introduce uncertainty during a time where investors are extremely spooked. Okay, proof of work has worked really well for Ethereum over the last several years. I guess it depends on what you qualify as really well, but obviously, price has done very well. Changing from proof of work to proof of stake will introduce some uncertainty in the short term. Therefore, I think the most realistic path for the Ether Bitcoin valuation for the next several months, at least going into the end of the year, is likely for it to go down off and on. It will have some types, sometimes it'll spike against Bitcoin, but off and on. And let me qualify that by not necessarily saying the end of the year. I will say through November, okay? A lot of times the Ether Bitcoin valuation actually recovers starting in December without really waiting until Q1. You can see here it started to recover in December. We didn't actually wait until January. There was another time, I believe, where you can see right here it occurred in mid-December as well. So let's say I think the Ether Bitcoin valuation is likely going to bleed against Bitcoin off and on through November of 2022, which means there's still several months to experience that. We understand that Ether USD does not have the best returns in the summer. We understand that the Bitcoin dominance is looking like it wants to go a lot higher, just like it did in 2018. And we understand that upon the first lower low by Bitcoin in 2018, that is what ultimately led to people losing confidence on the altcoin market. I don't consider ETH an alt, but just bear with me, right? Upon the first lower low, even though Bitcoin had a rally, Ether Bitcoin still bled. So I look at this and say, yet again, like I did on May 2nd and May 3rd, this one was on the USD valuation, and we'll talk about that in a minute, and April 21st, right? It's likely going to come back down, okay? So we've made it down to this trend line, and now the question is are we going to break below it? And I would argue that we will, primarily because during bear markets, these trend lines are in fact made to be broken, right? They just don't hold up under long-term scrutiny. Okay, they do tend to break, and Bitcoin just broke its Bitcoin USD one. Ether broke its Ether USD one as well. And now I think you're going to see Ether's valuation against Bitcoin break this supporting trend line and ultimately fall below. And now that the tension has been released, you might wonder, well, can you give me anything that's bullish, right? Anything. Well, it's hard to be bullish during a time like this, but maybe the one silver lining is if you do look at 2016, you could argue that we did put in a lower low here and then we went back up. And so if you look at what Ethereum has done, you could argue that it could be doing some type of similar pattern. I don't really know if I believe it at this point, considering all the macro stuff going on in the world, and I think that's important to include when discussing about risk on assets. It's something we've not talked about a lot, but I'm trying to get better at it. So considering that, it seems like we could, we already broke the tension, right? The tension already broke in terms of the higher lows. Now the only question is, here's the big question, right? Is the breakdown from the high, from this sort of local, let's say from the high, let me actually draw back the trend lines on here. So is the breakdown going to look like this, where it breaks down 50%? Or is it going to break down 84%? Okay, you can look at this one and argue that the breakdown from these higher lows so far, it's been about 35%, 37%. So a 50% breakdown might put it at around $1,400, but you can see this also put in a lower low, okay? So the one silver lining is that if Bitcoin breaks down against the US dollar and goes, let's say, to the 200-week moving average, meaning it goes back to around $22,000, then perhaps Ether would go back close to its prior all-time high of $1,400. And if that is the case, and Bitcoin bounces off the 200-week, and Ether bounces by association, then perhaps you could see something like that play out. I'm not so convinced until the Fed gets a little bit more dovish. So I would say it probably makes sense to just stay on defense here with regards to with regards to a lot of cryptocurrencies. And you can look at the fractals, and we've talked about this fractal before about it looking somewhat like it. However, even though it looks like it still ultimately did put in a lower low, which I don't really think we've done, not in any consequential manner. And then furthermore, you could also argue that it looks also somewhat like this fractal as well, right? I mean, if you take this fractal, you could argue that it looks like it, albeit a muted version of it, right? So like maybe it looks like it, but it's just not as strong of a version of it. And if that happens, then you could see some type of a breakdown. But to be completely honest, the USD valuation stuff is very hard to predict. Obviously, Bitcoin's in a bear market, but it can get bounces. I mean, even though Ether Bitcoin was bleeding in June and July of 2018, you can go look at Ether USD. I don't even know what Ether USD was doing. It was actually going sideways during that time. Let me pull off the not the Heikin-Ashi candles, but just the normal candles. You can see that during that time, Ether USD was more or less flat at around $460, even though Bitcoin bounced. Imagine how crazy that would be if like Bitcoin bounced to 35K or something and Ether just stayed at $2,000, plus or minus a couple $100. Like that'd be kind of crazy, but that's exactly what happened in 2018. Now, Ethereum is of course more mature than it was in 2018, so I don't think it's going to be quite as bad of a take in turn. Even if the bear market does persist for months to come, I don't think it'll bleed quite as bad. But it is something that people should be aware, and that I do think the Ether Bitcoin valuation will likely continue to go down for months to come. So look, you guys know I'm an Ether bull. I've been an Ether bull forever. Even the first video I have on my channel is talking about, literally, I made a video on Ether Bitcoin in September of 2019 saying this is the momentum shift, right? Go back to my channel, the very first video. We said this is the momentum shift of the Ether Bitcoin valuation. The first video on my channel, okay? I don't know that this has to necessarily be a breakdown back down to these levels, right? You could argue that the Ether Bitcoin valuation is on some type of logarithmic regression curve, perhaps. And I mean, that's somewhat dubious, but it certainly could be some type of plausible path to say that it's, it looks like it's on some type of regression curve where it's slowly gaining value against Bitcoin over time. And then maybe this is the fair value that it ultimately goes back to. Like it goes to it here and then here, and it's been some time there. So perhaps we have to go back down to it for a while and oscillate around it. I don't know, right? I don't know. But I will say there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the Ether Bitcoin valuation will go down over the next half year or so. The counterpoint is to say, well, the merge will make that so that's not true. You could be right, but I think it's just going to introduce uncertainty in an already very uncertain macro environment, which is not going to lead to any good things. And furthermore, it could be delayed, which would likely just lead to people losing hope in the short term. Okay, so it feels kind of like we're resetting right now, and that ultimately we will trend higher. Remember, ETHUSD is not the same thing as Ether Bitcoin. Ether Bitcoin could go down, not because Ether USD is going down, but just because Bitcoin's going up. That's exactly what happened in 2018, okay? Ether Bitcoin went down, not because Bitcoin or Ether was going down, but because Bitcoin was going up and Ether just wasn't following it, okay? It just is what it is, right? It is what it is. So let me know what you guys think. I know it's a bearish video. I want to be a Bitcoin and an Ether bull, but you know, it's hard to be bullish on the Ether Bitcoin valuation when we're seeing a lot of these seasonality type things play out. So I'll be an Ether Bitcoin bull again one day. And by that, I mean, I'll be a bull on the Ether Bitcoin valuation again one day. But unfortunately, that day is not today. Thank you guys for tuning in. Subscribe, give the video a thumbs up. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.